the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention, hey, we've got a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider dropping us $1 a month there if you can. But if not, I'd really like to have someone help us out with an iTunes review, maybe. We've got an ugly one up there that I'd like to move down, so consider that. But today, Taylor and I are happy to bring you Stephen Zepke, making a return appearance on the show. Stephen's an independent researcher living in Vienna. He is author of Sublime Art Towards an Aesthetics of the Future and Art as Abstract Machine, Ontology and Aesthetics in Deleuze and Guattari, as well as Head in the Stars, Essays on Science Fiction. But the last time that Stephen joined us, we discussed Guattari's screenplay. I'll put that episode in the notes. That was actually before Taylor officially joined the MUHH team. All that said, Stephen, it's so great to have you back. I'm sorry it's been so long since we've spoken. I feel a little bit guilty because I tremendously enjoyed our last discussion. So I'm really glad to have you back. I'm really excited to hear you and Taylor go back and forth and introduce you two. So yeah, just thanks for taking the time to join us on the show.
My pleasure.
And you've written a lot more than what, we wouldn't have time to cover all the stuff you've written on. I told Coop that I was excited that you guys were simpatico and already had recorded. I was telling my wife last night, who doesn't give a shit about any of this stuff. I was like, yeah, we're talking to a guy tomorrow. He's at least in English, the forefront thinker on Deleuze, Guattari, and aesthetics. And she's just like, yeah. Whatever that means. But for me, that's like a big fucking deal, and I was telling her some other stuff. I was explaining to her about, non-philosophy and non-Euclidean geometry. And she was like, I failed geometry in high school. So I don't, whatever you say doesn't, really register. But in any case, you've always been on like my radar as the go-to guy for, Deleuze aesthetics. And obviously you've branched out since then, which is exciting.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
I mean, hey.
I just didn't get a job. And one of the reasons why I didn't get the job apparently was because I was a Deleuzian, which basically means that I'm now engaged in a historical period of philosophy and not in contemporary philosophy. And so this is one of the interesting things that happens when you get excited about something when you're young, is that if you kind of stick with it, then you see yourself turning into this kind of historical entity as you go along, even though you don't really recognize it in yourself. So
did you not get hired because you're in Vienna? Because I thought the Aussies really liked Deleuze, right? Like I thought.
No. It was one. No,
New Zealand.
I come from New Zealand via Australia. I did my PhD more or less in Australia, but no, I mean, there were various reasons why I didn't get the job, but one of them was that I was too Deleuzian. So, but apart from that, not getting the job, that is, it is definitely true. I mean, because I work a lot in the art world, and I, work a lot in art schools and art institutions, and they are kind of very closely registered to whatever's going on in the philosophy world, or maybe slightly more broadly the theory world. So you can really kind of register your own, it's like the classic line about the bands who, you play the same venues on the way up and on the way down. It's like you can kind of see, the trajectory of what you're into according to the number of invites and the status of the institutions that you've been invited to. The Deleuze thing has definitely been on the downward curve, in the last years. In the art world, at the least, I would say, and I think there has been a kind of historical shift now, and so it's part of a historical movement, whether you want to call that 68 or something else,
Mhm.
that definitely seems to have kind of settled into its historical position.
If it makes you feel better, I dropped out of grad school because I knew I wasn't going to get a job being too Deleuzian, too Laruellian, too Guattarian. So I solidarity in that front. Deleuze is still kind of even if places like Edinburgh really churn out his works on him, I think he's still in America relegated to literature departments for the most part. But that's a whole nother story that we've talked about. We do like to start with the origin story, right, Coop?
Well, that's appropriate then.
Have you asked Stephen about his origin story before?
I don't think we did I recall?
No,
but it's been
I
a couple
don't
of years
think so.
now.
No, I don't think we talked about that. But yeah, I mean, my origin story is, I mean, it's interesting if you talk to people that are into Deleuze, Guattari, because I've definitely heard my origin story out of other people's lips as well. And, I was an undergraduate. I was super interested in French theory, more or less because nobody knew anything about it in New Zealand. So that seemed like just a good reason to be into it, without knowing anything about it. And I kind of threw myself, first of all, into Lacan and then into Derrida and various other things. And, I was totally into that. And I used a lot of Derrida in my master's thesis. And then a friend of mine kind of said, oh, you got to read this. And he gave me a copy of 1,000 Plateaus.
Awesome.
And I started reading it and I was like, oh my God.
What the fuck is this? But it's awesome.
No, what I thought was, this is about me.
Oh,
this is about me. And it was like the first time I'd ever read a piece of philosophy, not having a huge amount of experience at that point, but nevertheless having read Lacan and Derrida. And with them, I was only ever just trying to decode this stuff, which seemed so incredibly obscure to me. That was where the excitement was. But with Deleuze and Guattari, it was like they were actually telling me about things that were actually happening in my life and that I regarded as being kind of personal. And so that was a total mind blower, that philosophy could actually be about your own life, about my own life. And it wasn't just some abstract stuff that I was trying to understand what it all meant, but it didn't really have anything to do with me, which is maybe bizarre because I know a lot of people read Lacan and think that it's all about themselves, but I didn't have that. I didn't have that response to it at all. So that was the Deleuze and Guattari thing, and then that was basically it. And then after that, I was just basically full-time immersed in Deleuze, Guattari right through for the next kind of 15 years, I would say, and didn't really get out of it until relatively recently, I guess. So that was me. It was just like the concepts they were using and the ideas that they had. I just totally identified with it. I mean, maybe partly that's a biographical thing as well, in the sense that I come from New Zealand, which is like, at least when I grew up in the 80s and the early 90s, it was like there was nothing there, like there was really nothing, hardly anything going on. So, I had this trajectory of getting out, from a really early age, and this kind of trajectory, I just found that in Deleuze and Guattari so clearly. It's like they, when they write about a line of flight, and I was like, oh well, yeah, that's me, I mean, that's what I'm doing. I just got to get out. And then I went to Australia, and then after 5 years or 6 years in Australia, I was like, I've got to get out. And then it was like I come to Europe, and so I guess that was it. They just seemed to be describing something that was very, very personal.
Well, besides the line of flight, what else can you recall that really grabbed you? I mean,
let me answer that question on a slight tangent, but
okay, good. Sure on a line of flight.
I'm sure it will explain everything to you. My first PhD that I started doing but never finished, in fact, never really got very far with, which the reasons for which will become obvious soon, was a PhD that was supervised by Brian Masumai. And
oh my God, awesome.
It was called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll.
Oh, okay.
It had like three parts, one devoted to each of the three. Anyway, I won't go into all details. I'm not even 100% convinced.
I can see it. I can see it. Sex, psychoanalysis, drugs with
It had a whole structure, but I didn't finish it, and then I started something much more kind of academic shortly after that. But it was basically, when I say that they were talking about my own life, it was obviously those parts, especially in 1,000 Plateaus, where they're talking about drug users or they're talking about liminal experiences, absolute deterritorialization. That became a theme when I did my kind of proper PhD, which was supervised by Paul Patton, the translator of difference repetition. We used to have these supervision meetings where it would be like, he'd be like, it's not about absolute deterritorialization. It's about relative deterritorialization. I'm like, no, I was like, no way. It's all about absolute deterritorialization. And that was like,
Right.
that was the kind of stuff that I was really fascinated by. I was like, how can we just, let's get really out of it and see what happens. I mean, that was the research trajectory in every way, basically. That was the kind of thing that appealed to me so much about Deleuze and Guattari, because they basically seem to be philosophizing this trajectory. And I mean, I didn't really know it at the time, but in retrospect, I would say that is the 68 thing. And of course, nowadays, a lot of that 68 thing is very uncomfortable to people because it clashes with the kind of newfound moralism of the contemporary world. And at that time, it was still pretty cool.
As we told you before, we've done the 68 trilogy of Lyotard, Anti-Oedipus, Libidinal Economy, and Symbolic Exchange of Death. And I will say, it makes sense that you never finished your PhD on sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because how can one ever finish with sex, drugs, and rock and roll? And
I'm still in my undergrad for this.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say that, they themselves, especially Deleuze, when you hear that interview in the Opposite Air, they themselves do kind of vacillate between absolute D, relative D, and the merits of both. And I think that's why in A Thousand Plateaus, they make it more clear that reterritorialization and deterritorialization come together. They come like form and content, right? They are not form and content. What is it? Content and expression. Sorry. They kind of come together in terms of strata. So I could see why then you and Patton would have had the back and forth. The dialectical point would be that it's both and neither, I guess, right? Like something like that.
I think it's like, it would be an interesting project to kind of do a genealogy of the relative and absolute D, as you call it, in the kind of reception of Deleuze and Guattari, because I know that, in the early 2000s, there was definitely a strong school of reception that was all about relative deterritorialization.
Interesting.
And kind of macro politics rather than micro politics. And in fact, I can remember being hit up at a Deleuze conference, I think it was about 2008 in Amsterdam, and I gave my paper, and Rosie Bridotti got up in the end and had an absolute go at me about exactly this point.
Oh my God.
Macro versus micro deterritorialization, which for a relatively young academic was quite a demoralizing experience, but everyone assured me afterwards that she'd done it a million times before, so that made me feel me feel a bit.
That means she likes you, right? That means she likes you if she's grilling you.
She did come up to me the next day and sort of say, "Oh, we're such good friends now."
Damn.
But anyway,
I don't think I could be that cruel.
There was, at least at that time, and I'm not really sure how unfolded after that, but people like Paul Patton and Rosie Bridotti as well was another one, and there were various others who were definitely pushing this kind of social democracy Deleuze. And I'm afraid, my background is, when I arrived in Vienna, I immediately came into contact with Eric Alliers, and he was been a PhD student of Deleuze's, and his approach was totally different. Like, he was all about 68. That was. I mean, even though he was, I think he was 11 years old in 1968, but that was his thing completely, and he'd come through the whole kind of Italian connection with Deleuze and Guattari and the radicals, and been involved in all of that as a young man. And, he was personally very close with Guattari, and, he was all about sort of libidinal politics, let's put it like that. But, if you scratch too much into it these days, it would be like a massive red flag.
Not to us. Or we raise our red flags high. If you want to say that, that's our.
I mean, is it not the accelerationist sort of thing? I mean, at the end of the day, ultimately,
Well, it depends on the type of accelerationism you're talking about, I suppose.
Yeah.
But,
right. There's left, right, unrestrained.
There's left and yeah.
I mean, I just think we're in it. There's nothing we can do about it. Try to help others as much as you can, and that's about it.
Now,
I think that's a pretty good policy, but I think
there's hope for the best. But I don't think there's no Messiah that's going to come and save us. I think we're headed.
Hang on a second, isn't that vitalism?
Could be what?
Oh, but
Yeah,
I'll
could be. Maybe I've been reading too much Dune. Is the
Isn't
Well,
Brothers
it's-
in the
thing.
Messiah?
Stephen, you quote, and this isn't to get into Laruelle early, but this is anticipating maybe. You quote, Struggle and Utopia in the End Times of Philosophy, one of Laruelle's works. And the opening of the book, Coop, is, should humanity be saved? Is it even a question?
Oh, nice.
So I'm gonna go ahead and throw that out in case you're gonna bring in Dune Messiah or any questions of Messiah. Like maybe we don't need a messianism in terms of generic humanity. But
What's the book?
Struggle and Utopia in the End Times of
Struggle
Philosophy.
and Utopia in Times of Philosophy. Okay.
So he opens this question like, is it even a question of saving humanity? And I think that there's, if you want to like say it in a nutshell, even though it doesn't do it justice, we're sort of always already saved. There is some sort of notion of man as one being, if you want to say foreclosed to being saved to salvation, like it's already imminent. In any case, that got a little deep. We were talking about cooler things.
No, but I find that really interesting because, I struggle so much about, what is the future in Laruelle? What is the possibility that he opens up? And it's interesting because what I was thinking about when you were saying that is there's this this criticism of Deleuze that I came across in Ray Brazier's book, which is that, when he talks about science, he really only talks about the biological sciences and he's not really that much interested in the hard sciences. And maybe this question of yours gave me this kind of thought of like, well, I don't know Laruelle exhaustively, but from what I know, he, I think, is more interested in the mathematics or the hard sciences, quantum physics, all of that. But I can't really think of a time when, at least in my limited reading of Laruelle, that he discusses biological sciences. And if we're going to talk about the future of humanity or should humanity be saved or whatever, it's like I even struggle to kind of see what a biological trajectory would be post-auto position, how does like life work under a system of determination in the last instance?
He talks about it as the lived without life. You even like quote this in your paper,
I mean, this
right?
is like a typical formulation.
Lived experience without life. He has an essay that I bootleg translated on my website, and Jeremy Smith has got a translation of it too, which I think he's trying to publish, called Homo Ex Machina. It's 1980, so it's kind of early Laruelle philosophy 1, as you might categorize it, going into philosophy 2, where he's talking about, he's still citing, which he never does anymore, thinkers like Foucault. He's talking about biopolitics. So this early work, you have glimpses of, let's just say, him talking about biology in a broad sense, in the sense in which he will later focus more on just like technology. He's got an essay on Simondon and Heidegger, right, as the two thinkers of technics. And I think that for Laruelle, one of the quotes that he has that I love in that essay, because I think that Coop, when we had Jeremy on, we talked to him about this essay, right? That was the whole focus. And so I won't like belabor the point, but one of the quotes I really like that he has is from Nietzsche, from the Gay Science, about how we're going to become our own guinea pigs in terms of experimenting on ourselves. And I think that for Laruelle, that experimentation is part and parcel of kind of what he sees non-philosophy doing, because there is an experimentation in non-philosophy as it takes philosophy as material. And, I think that that's part of it in terms of, what happens when we suspend philosophy's belief in itself as pertaining to the real, as co-determining the real, or however you want to say it. And I think that opens up these new vantage points. Obviously, as you mentioned, he's trying to talk about this sometimes in different registers, whether it be psychoanalysis, like in philosophy 3, or in philosophy 5. In the most recent iteration, he's talking about it in terms of quantum physics, what happens when we kind of look at philosophy as a corpuscle, which is this kind of outdated mode of science, and we think about it as a particle that can be subsumed under a waveform, all of this stuff that probably would beguile scientists like, Sokal and Brickball. You could imagine a new fashionable nonsense that would, when Laruelle was talking about quantum mechanics, he's not talking about it as a scientist. And I think that
No, he uses it as a metaphor.
metaphor, maybe, Deleuze would hate that, right? Obviously, he's like, no metaphor, right? That would be the worst thing for Deleuze. I think that for Laruelle, one of the metaphors that he uses is the non-Euclidean metaphor. And that's one of my favorites. He'll call it a metaphor, right? That the non-philosophy is not negative. And I think that's why he doesn't even want to call it non-philosophy anymore. He wants to call it non-standard, maybe closer to like non-standard analysis. He'll want to call it non-standard philosophy, but the non is, of course, this question of lifting a postulate. And in lifting a postulate, we actually lift a restricted point of view and are able to liberate thinking in this way. And I was trying
that's a cool idea. And I like that. And you can kind of see the potential of lifting the correlation, which I think he does a good job of kind of locating in the history of metaphysics. But my problem with it is that it's like I'm not convinced that he really wants to experiment with it. I just think he is just totally into kind of destroying it, he's totally into the application of the non. And basically at the end of that, you've got his system as far as he's laid it out. And then you've got what? Then I don't know what you've got after that. You've got the destruction of the existing system, the kind of outline of a new system, which is his. But what is super unclear to me is what that really is. Like, what does it really mean? It's like in that paper that I did on Laruelle, which is like, you have to have full disclosure. It's my first thing I've written on Laruelle. So I'm not speaking here from a position of authority, but the thing that I was super interested in was that it's often suggested that you've mentioned it yourself just then, experimentation or some kind of, obviously nowadays fashionable, this sort of artistic research practice, or, I know people who have written PhDs using Laruelle that's sort of half photography, half poetry, half kind of theory, Jesus, and all that. And then it's like, but when I started really getting into it, I thought, well, hang on a second. I don't think there's really a lot of room for raising up art as a new kind of methodology or a non-philosophical methodology, because aesthetics is totally out the window. It's like there is no subject, there is no object, there is no kind of, there is determination in the last instance, which is like not really aesthetic. There's no human feeling, emotion, anything like that. That's all gone out the window. Like, what are we really talking about now?
Yeah.
Like, there is no politics, or just only this kind of super vaguely delimited anger at authorities, which is cool. Like, it's good vibe, but it's like, what are we meant to do? Is it a cosmic om? That's like, I've done all this reading of Laruelle with this friend of mine, Tony Carusi. And, this is what we kind of came back to sometimes, that it's like some kind of cosmic om, and it's just like a kind of pure singularity where you're just sort of sitting cross-legged in the middle of it, I mean, is that it? I mean, I don't know. I mean, probably not, but it's like we could never really figure out what it was.
What I see is what you're characterizing is perhaps Laruelle's constant attempts to reformulate and reshuffle. As he says, he wants to reshuffle the cards, if you will, of the history of philosophy and put into light what he's trying to elaborate with the one, unilateral duality, et cetera, et cetera. He's trying to formalize a way in which non-philosophy can be practiced. But in terms of us who are reading him, I think, and who want to perhaps put to work non-philosophy in various registers, I think we are given the liberty to then take it in so many different directions. I think the problem you're describing is the fact that so much legwork needs to be done to first make clear what Laruelle is trying to do. Even though Laruelle has done that himself, we also need to make clear first the kind of some of the principles and the methodologies that he's doing in order to then do the work, which one of them could be what he calls non-aesthetics. And even though he doesn't go into this very much, he himself is kind of a trained musician. He's written on music in his very early work that will eventually be made available. But for him, I think non-aesthetics is you can combine any artistic composition with any composition of thought without limit. And I think that for him, this is a consequence of, for example, lifting the sufficiency of philosophy, which wants to have one decision per thought or per area of whether it be science, being, region of being, as Heidegger might say. It wants to restrict that to like one per one, right? In a kind of Parmenidean matrix or just the classical view. And I think if you can combine any artistic composition with any composition of thought, there is what he calls these fractal islands of non-aesthetic possibilities that can blossom out. Now, he may not be doing that in terms of what he's trying to formalize, which is putting into practice the theory of non-philosophy, but perhaps we can do that. And I think that that's why I see a connection with Guattari, who himself in Chaosmosis is thinking about these possibilities of new subjectivities based on cultivating a virtual ecology, et cetera. So I think Guattari is actually practicing this more than Laruelle. We have to follow Guattari to actually do the Laruellian stuff, even if Laruelle isn't doing it. So he's kind of like Moses at the promised land. He's not going to enter it, but maybe he can lead us there.
I think it's a very optimistic idea. No, that's the wrong way to say it. It's a seductive idea to say, okay, he's kind of laid out the system, he's done the destructive work, and then now it's up to us to we can do something with it, we can develop it in this way. But I guess my question is who the fuck is this we? What is this we? I'm sorry, but I don't think there's a we in Laruelle. There is nothing left of subjectivity. It's there's no relationship to an object. It's I find it really difficult to imagine there is no phenomenon, there is no perception that runs through a kind of biological perceptive system in any way similar to what we are familiar with now. That's why I asked the question about biological science. It seems an extraordinarily difficult invitation, if you like. It's a fascinating one. It's difficult to drive somewhere where all the bits of the car's been destroyed. Positive parts of the system are so kind of violent in a way that it's hard for me to see how you kind of get up and start walking with them. I'm just left sort of stunned and amazed at this point that he's succeeded in getting us to, but I'm kind of have this feeling of being obliterated that I don't know how the body works anymore, or, how I can perceive anything, or if I do perceive something, what is it that I'm perceiving, or what is perception itself? It's clearly not aesthetic in any kind of Kantian sense.
Well, okay.
He's very specific about that, because he's very specific about getting rid of that. So it's on the one side, I'm totally impressed with it, but on the other side, I'm sort of frustrated with this not being kind of adequate to it in some way, or not being able to see the possibilities.
I think that for me, Laruelle, if he might formulate it in a different way, but I see him kind of leading us to what Deleuze and Guattari call for, which is, a new people and a new earth. And I see that insofar as you focus on the destructive aspect of the non, and I see it less destructive as, he wants to call it suspensive. If anything is destroyed, it's sufficiency. It's not, non-philosophy doesn't destroy philosophy, same way that non-Euclidean geometry doesn't destroy Euclidean geometry. And in terms of our everyday perceptions, we may spontaneously practice philosophy when we think, and that's going to always happen. We may spontaneously perceive in Euclidean forms. The point being is that even if philosophy can be translated into non-philosophy and transformed as material, same way that Euclidean geometry can be translated into non-Euclidean geometry and transformed, the other way around, you lose something. That's the violence, is going back after the transformation. So working through the transformative principle does take some legwork. And I think that's what the majority of what he's done is try to lay down foundations for formalizing this. And I think that's also perhaps true of I think this is why Chaosmosis came out in a new light, reading your retrospective on it, 20 years on, now 21, if you will, or we're getting there, 21 years on, that what Guattari is talking about is a lot of the stuff that I think follows from the new perspectives that are open once we sort of lift the suspensive principle of philosophy's warmongering ways, right? Because I think Guattari you call him a philosopher in your work, but in many ways, he's kind of like a mad scientist, as I try to say it, right? He's not bound to he's not like Deleuze in a certain way, right? Deleuze may be reversing Plato, reversing Kant, taking up Bergson against Bergsonian duration versus Kantian time out of joint, et cetera, et cetera. But like Guattari, I don't think he's worried about the squabbles between schools. Guattari is not really worried about whether we're reversing a philosopher or not, because in a certain way, if you're reversing Plato, if you're reversing Kant, et cetera, you're still within the same system. And I think he's very much more Laruellian. And if you just suspend all of that, you're not even worried about turning around or rotating. You're doing your own thing. And I think that's why, if anything, I think chaosmosis has the elements of what non-philosophy could look like from a certain vantage point. I mean, I really think you brought that out in your work, for example, just the possibilities of seeing things anew, of mutant subjectivities, right? I think that's.
I mean, there's definitely something there. I mean, I had thought about some kind of direct compare and contrast of chaos between Guattari and Laruelle, because it is a term in Laruelle, maybe not as central as it is in Guattari. But, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean, sure, it's totally right what you say that Guattari is not really a philosopher, but he's kind of like an enthusiast for philosophy.
Yeah.
And, it's like there's two kind of things about Guattari that for me kind of a kind of describe his character really well. I mean, one of them is, if you read the letters that he sent Deleuze, that was part of for the writing of Anti-Oedipus. So the way the relationship works is that Guattari is writing these letters, he sends them to Deleuze. Deleuze can't read them, can't read his handwriting. So Fanny, Deleuze's wife, transcribes them, types it up, and then Deleuze kind of takes that, and then he basically writes that in his own words, and that's the book. And Guattari complains about it, or he writes in his journal, that he struggles to recognize himself in large parts of the book. But when you read the letters, it's like the letters are amazing, because you can see how the content is in the book, but the tone is not in the book, right? Because the tone is Deleuze's tone. Because Guattari is like, he's on a permanent rave.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just all coming out, and it's just ideas. And, you can see why Deleuze was probably kind of excited about it, but you can also see how he wanted to keep this distance from him. Because that's the other anecdote from the time, is that Guattari's constantly trying to get Deleuze to come along to groups, right? Because Guattari's involved in like 300 groups.
Yes, exactly.
And so he was constantly trying to get, and Deleuze says the famous line, look, 2 is already a bit too much. It's like, and the other thing, so that's one thing about Guattari that I think is totally true what you say, is that, he's not relating to the philosophical material necessarily as a philosopher, but as an enthusiast. And the other thing is, that he's a psychoanalyst. And there's this great anecdote about an analyst hand that he has, which is a guy from Chile, a Chilean who's a political exile in Paris. And he goes to Guattari because he's having an incredibly hard time, because he's feeling so upset and so depressed that his friends are getting imprisoned and tortured and killed, and he's sitting in Paris, having a coffee, whatever,
right,
at the cafe, and he's really worried about this. And then Guattari says to him, look, you can come to me and you can kind of moan about your personal situation, whatever, if you want. But, I could help you, and I could turn you into a political militant.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And the guy's like, oh, I mean, I'm sure it was not quite as shortened as this, but in the end, that's what happens. Like, he does an analysis with Guattari, and the result of that analysis is that he becomes a political militant.
Yeah.
And that's how he deals with his psychological problems around being in exile in Paris when his friends are being tortured and murdered in Chile. And I was like, wow, fuck, because I don't know if I have some personal experience with psychoanalysis, and this is definitely not the approach that most analysts are going to take with you, right? It's like non-interventionists, they don't even tell you really what they try really hard not to tell you what they think. And the whole concept of analysis is something completely different.
Of course.
And so Guattari is going to, there is a tradition of this kind of analysis that Guattari also draws from, a more interventionist style. But, I just think that's also really great. So that's the thing is, so at this point, I'm thinking, okay, Laruelle, Guattari turning the guy into the political militant. Laruelle, I can't, that doesn't seem to be what Laruelle is trying to say. Guattari is all about kind of involvement, and that's exactly the part that I find difficult to join the dots with Laruelle, because it seems so much about the non. He seems to get off so much on this kind of detachment, and it's very interesting. And I understand the potential of pushing it out and that we carry it on and make it into something else, or develop it in ways that are more directly connected to the world, or connected to the world in different ways. But like from the point of view of the personality, I just feel like there's fundamental kind of differences in it. It's like, I don't know.
Laruelle is very much closer to Deleuze in temperament, I think.
Yeah, that would be my feeling too.
I always think of something like a signifying rupture or like a signification. I feel like I get this kind of same feeling that you're describing, Stephen, with regard to Guattari specifically. Laruelle, I'm just not breaking with the
signifier, breaking with the dominance of philosophical decision. I see Guattari is already practicing that, whereas
representing
Laruelle
without representing, representing without representation. What is that? What is a non-signifying assemblage of enunciation? How does that?
Well, I think
we're not there yet, right? Like we're just not the strata.
No,
substratum is not developed enough for that sort of evolution just yet, and we may not. I don't know that we'll get there, but I don't. Is that like the level that he's thinking at?
This is a crucial point, I think, that you make here, Cooper, because in Guattari, what that is, the asignifying rupture, that's aesthetics. That's why, it's so interesting to think art, in relationship to Guattari, I think, because...
I mean, like the Duchamp fountain, perhaps, is that the like crystallized expression
well,
of
asignifying
rupture? I kind of think maybe it is. Like it's sort of, I think, the way that I understand it kind of approaches that idea.
There is an asignifying rupture that then produces a proliferation of affect. And I think those two things can't really be separated. But I think that's something I'm not really convinced that I'm not really sure where to put affect in Laruelle, because the fact that he wants to step around Kant makes it really difficult to understand. I don't know, Taylor, maybe you have a kind of an idea about that. But I think for Guattari, I think Deleuze and Guattari are kind of post-Kantian in this very perverted way. But they are post-Kantian in the sense that aesthetics is basically ontology. It's basically vitalism is basically aesthetics and aesthetic in its operation, and thought and signifying and representation and all of that comes afterwards. And
for sure.
And in Laruelle, I don't know, it's like, I don't know, Taylor, what do you do with aesthetics, and what is non-aesthetics? Like, is that an asignifying rupture? That is,
I think so.
I do non-photography. I think the non-photography may be the like way to get into that, but obviously I haven't read it, so I can't really speak to that very well.
You
can.
That's an example, but the way I see non-aesthetics is if Laruelle is giving us ways in which the formalized theory and practice of how non-philosophy can take philosophy as material, transform it according to these axioms, and then produce something new. There is already inherent in practicing non-philosophy what we would call a non-aesthetic, what he calls these fractal islands, because there's no one way to transform it. Even if you have these rules for transformation, you don't necessarily have to keep doing what Laruelle is doing, which is trying to exposit the way in which one practices it.
Right.
But actually doing it, he has some examples, these experimental texts. One of the most famous is in it's the McKay volume that I contributed to. What the fuck's it called? From Decision to...
From Decision to Heresy.
Yeah, From Decision to Heresy. He's got the Universe Black. That's his most famous. But he's also got I've translated one, the Biography of the Eye. It takes one of Hegel's formulas about, you look at another man in the eye and you see nothingness, and he riffs on it. He's got these experimental texts from the 80s showing what non-aesthetics might look like if we practice the non-philosophical transformation of material. He's got the another one that I translated, again, bootleg on the internet, is taking Parmenides' being and thinking are the same, and he kind of riffs on this. It's a lot of riffing. It's kind of like what we do on the fucking show in a certain way, except we do it spontaneously. Yeah. He's trying to like show how
Systematized spontaneity. Yeah.
show how philosophy is always already spontaneously riffing and is its own type of aesthetics. But when it tries to think itself as, whether it be aesthetic or when it tries to think itself as philosophy, it spontaneously practices a kind of warfare. It spontaneously tries to assert its own method as being closer to the real. I always take the classic example of Hegel being like, well, there's Fichte, there's Schelling. I'm the culmination point. I'm higher than, I'm closer to the real in my Alphabung. And I see Laruelle kind of saying, like, isn't this just philosophy to core? Isn't this just what philosophy is always already trying to do, which is that in its spontaneous faith in itself, it's getting closer to the real. It pretends, it claims to be closer. And so there's something about, you could say, like Deleuze overturning the model copy relation and the fucking anarchy of simulacra. There's a certain, if you will, a kind of crown anarchy of simulacra in the non-aesthetic production of non-philosophical statements from philosophical material as occasion. And I think the only thing that Laruelle calls for is a kind of vigilance. And this is where he's close to Guattari, because he's like, look, if we can create these fractal islands of productions, taking philosophical material, transforming it, making this kind of artistic linguistic transformation, this rehandling, as he calls it, we have to also be willing to collapse everything down to the non-system, because otherwise we get a little lazy, we rest on our laurels, and then these new kind of, this sufficiency is always creeping up and willing to create the illusion of being once and for all, when it has to be done one time each time. The Guattari in The Machine of Unconscious himself, he lays out these principles for approaching the unconscious, like micro-politically and pragmatically. But he's like, look, these rules all have to be able to be collapsible. Everything has to be able to be collapsed and start again, because you're always dealing with an analysis one time each time. You're always in the thick of it. You're always dealing with an occasion and not some sort of disembodied abstract theory. Even if that seems like what Laruelle is always doing, if we apply Laruelle and if we see some of his examples of application, like the Leibnizian variants, like the Parmenidean variants, like the universe black, like the Hegelian biography of the eye, he shows examples of these aesthetic productions that I think gives us more flavor of what non-philosophy could be. And it helps to kind of bring to life these abstract notions of suspending philosophy's faith. Because I was kind of thinking about this last night, there's this sense in which philosophy spontaneously practicing, it develops cults in the same way that religions do.
Oh, for sure.
And I think
this is the central danger of philosophy, is the way that it sort of relies on individuals
and their belief,
and it almost raises individual to these transcendental,
it's not the only
these transcendental authority figures that we have to sort of.
Even Deleuze
does it too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But look, can I just follow up on that,
please?
Because it's a very interesting idea. But what I want to ask is this, like, as we were kind of talking about a little bit before, for Deleuze, for Guattari, the way out, let's say, if we're going to talk in a generous Laruellian way, the way out of the correlation for Deleuze and Guattari is aesthetic, because sensation is going to be something that at its source of production, if you like, emerges without kind of cognitive structure, right? Without it's not representational, it's not synthesized through the concepts. It's a kind of, like we were talking about, a kind of a crowned anarchy of sort of emergence. And then if you talk about Laruelle, and that there are these kind of aesthetic examples, but I'm just not sure whether these aesthetic examples emerge or can emerge in the same way, because they're not tied to a kind of aesthetic structure in the way that the Deleuze and Guattari ones are, that they're not. Or are they? I don't know. But it just seems from my reading that it's not about, you do not experience a piece of music as an individual experiencing the production of sound in the same way for Laruelle as you would for Deleuze and Guattari. I don't know. That's the way it seems to me. I don't know if you see it that way.
I think this is close to like when Laruelle is talking about what he calls, non-rhetoric, which it's a use of rhetoric. You take philosophical rhetoric, we can imagine one of the most densely and ornate types of rhetoric, like, for example, in Spinoza, right? The ethics, which would, from a philosophical point of view, it eliminates all rhetoric, if you want, because it bases itself off of these axioms. It demonstrates the axioms and has these scholia, et cetera. So everything unfolds musically, almost. Everything unfolds logically. Everything unfolds without the kind of violence that persuasion might bring in. We can think Habermas, but, I think that Laruelle, this is kind of what he's thinking about in terms of style, that there could be these different proliferations of styles. He calls them strangerhoods, if you will. And the strangerhoods would be the different ways in which we, practicing non-philosophy, could take a text like the Ethics, or take a text even from Deleuze, from Nietzsche, et cetera. And if we apply the quote unquote, what he used to call vision in one, he doesn't really use that language anymore, but if we apply vision in one, which would be unilateralizing philosophy as second, right, as taking the point of view of the one, taking the point of view of its foreclosure, if philosophy can be rearranged, because there is an arrangement in the sense in which Deleuze talks about arrangements, Deleuze and Guattari, right? Agencement, right? There can be an assemblage, an arrangement, a rearrangement, a rehandling of philosophical material. That would each have its own style each time that we do it. So a lot of what I think that the production point of view sometimes that gets lost is more Derridian than not, right? Because there is a deconstruction of the philosophical text, but it doesn't stop there, because what's produced on the other side is from the point of view of the one, from vision in one.
Right, because there's no transcendental difference.
Right. And so what a text, what a material looks like on the other side, produced in new statements, because that's the thing. It's not just taking philosophy and ridding it of its sufficiency. That's just a theoretical move. The pragmatic move is the production of new statements. And the new has to be gauged solely based on what we see when we see philosophy in one, which is not easy, and it takes work. And I kind of think about some of this, a lot of it depends on which aspect or which even like regional aspect we look at. For example, we were talking about ontology earlier. Guattari in Chaosmosis comes up with this great phrase about, there's fractal geometry, which is great, but in fact, and this is a Simondonian point of view, I think, in fact, every being is always already sort of individuating, and it's fractal in and of itself. So we need to also have a fractal ontology in mind. You could even subtitle Chaosmosis as fractal ontology, although that would, although his point is an ethico-aesthetic paradigm, he's obviously focusing on that more or less, but there is a certain fractal ontology to like Laruelle's point of view, and the way that the fractals form is based on what are the liberating possibilities once philosophy sort of gets rid of all of its different forms of warfare, not only amongst itself, right? Because different philosophies are trying to vie for being the true, or the truth with a capital T, but also, and primarily, I think, philosophy's warfaring nature with science. I mean, philosophy has always had this need to try to, whether it be Kant, metaphysics is the queen of the sciences, whether it be Heidegger, that regional sciences need a phenomenology, a sort of, they need an ontology, they need to question being in order to like avoid their crises. We can imagine all of these different philosophers that have always been a little bit anxious about how science performs its own work spontaneously. And there may be problems there, but to a certain extent, science works, and it does work, but philosophy is always worried about its legitimacy. And I think it's that worry, it's that want to be science that prevents it from being more free. Because I think with Laruelle, non-philosophy allows language itself and representation to free up. Once it's no longer concerned with trying to mirror the real, trying to claim to be closer to the real or co-determinate, via language. Language itself becomes free for these new productions. Non-philosophy is positive, not just for transforming philosophy, but also being able to transform our ways of thinking about other disciplines, right? The region equals X, the X that you bring up, right? Which he gets from Kant, because I think there is a way in which Laruelle too is post-Kantian. I think that that's inevitable with contemporary thinkers, that, you know.
And tell me, sorry if I can just butt in here for a sec, because I'm curious about this too, so how do you see Guattari's relationship to science? Because I always took him as a bit of a science skeptic.
What does he say at the end of Chaosmosis? I hold my hand out to the future. There is this sense in which Guattari is skeptical. I think he forefronts his skepticism about the dangers that science bring. And yet at the same time, in those last pages of Chaosmosis and some of the last stuff that he's writing, he's like, hey, it's very tangible and palpable that these mutations of subjectivity, which he's always trying to put his finger on, like it's pulsing, these mutations of subjectivity are just as latent as the machinic enslavement that he's worried about. It's the same stuff that they talk about in Anti-Oedipus, about how subject groups are always able to fall back into whatever you want to call it, seriality in the language of Sartre, or subjugated groups in their language. There's always this threat. And I think that's why, like Laruelle, he's like, the non-system is the last instance. Everything has to be collapsible. We have to make sure we keep a bit of the death drive in institutions, because otherwise they become ossified. They turn back into seriality. They turn back into totalitarian, fascistic suicide machines. We've got to be able to take the positive side of the death drive, which is the sort of mortal affect that things need to break up and move on. This is, I think, why you said
this is what Dune is about, man. This is what Dune is about. This is the golden path. It really is. Honest. I'm not kidding whatsoever. But that really is the kernel of it.
This is why Guattari is in 300 groups and willing to leave, willing to break them down, willing to say, no, it's gone a different direction. This is also, I think, the grid. Nobody should be comfortable in doing just one task. Right. If everyone is sort of rotating and moving out, even if that was an imperfect design in practice, it had a sort of beautiful quality to it in theory.
Finitude.
Exactly. And so
yeah,
I'm playing
interesting,
defense.
right?
I'm playing defense, but yeah.
But that's, I mean, because the model at Labor, you know, where there's this kind of everyone's involved in the management of the institution, which, you know, quite no, I mean, there are working groups that are including staff and patients, and they're all involved in making decisions about the treatment and the structures of the institution, so forth and so on. And, you know, this kind of moving people around was like a crucial part of the treatment, which was, you know, if you're a lawyer, then you get put in the kitchen, or, you know, you've been a taxi driver, so you go in the garden, you know, this kind of thing. And I remember reading somewhere Guattari saying that, like, the two most important moments in his life was his divorce and learning to drive. But it's just that idea of, like, you know, okay, so you're constantly trying different possibilities, you're constantly trying different ways of doing things. And, you know, he calls this methodology at Labor, at one point he calls it, it's not institutional critique, but it's what is the word now? Institutional analysis.
That's right.
So doing the analysis with the patients is actually an institutional analysis, because you're kind of not just focusing on what their problems are, but you're focusing on their problems in the context of the institution and the way that the institution can help them or limit their possibilities and kind of moving into other things. So, I mean, I think this comes back a little bit to that question of participation, which we were talking about as well. And, you know, I just think to be generous, I would say, okay, so with Laruelle, we say that the possibilities of participation are kind of remain to be developed, you know, and perhaps you're right that there are strong indications in the axioms or whatever that can be done. But I guess I still haven't got past the point of being kind of a bit sort of stunned and amazed at the axioms and not quite able to make the next move, which is to work out, you know, where to go. Whereas, you know, Guattari was much more just like, he was just like constantly picking shit up and going like, oh, how does that work? What can I do with that? Can I join it to this? Can I join it to that? Can I join it to that? You know, where although the way you describe Laruelle and the way in which you describe this kind of fractal ontology, or a way of using different philosophies that normally wouldn't be connected to each other in new ways, sounds kind of really good. I'm just not quite sure what it means. Like, I'm not sure how it would work, but it's probably just because I don't really know it well enough.
This is good though. Two things. One, I like how Guattari talks about treating patients. You gave a great anecdote about the Chilean, right? And he's like, hey, maybe become a militant. And that was like, oh yeah. Guattari's like saying someone comes to analysis, they have always been a writer, or they've done, you gave the example of a lawyer, for example, doing menial chores or whatever. They come to analysis, they primarily been, at a desk writing. He puts them on a bike. They've primarily done menial labor. He sets them to writing, to playing music, to, so he's experimenting with desiring machines, or however the fuck you want to call it, desiring production. He's putting them on new paths that can open up these possibilities, their virtual universes of reference, if you will. Their universe of values,
That's the thing, I think, is that, there is this kind of mundane level in I think, Deleuze and Guattari. And it's not the level that I've often engaged with, but it's definitely there, which is that this kind of idea of de and reterritorialization, it's not a kind of, it's nothing sort of dramatic, it's just that. It's just like, someone's having problems in their life, so they learn how to drive.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the world opens up to them in a way which makes it exciting, new and vibrant again. And so that's a kind of way of treating sort of mental illness in a way that is totally different from a normal psychoanalytical session, where it's just, you're locked in, you're lying on the couch, you're locked in the room. The analyst is there trying to give absolutely nothing away because he thinks that's part of the process by which you're going to encounter your own limitations or your own problems. And it all just kind of disappears down this sort of hole. And I think Guattari is absolutely the opposite of that, because it's just about connecting to things. It's always, the rhizome's been so overused that I tend not to use it in my own work, but that's the point. It's a point of like, a rhizome is like a whole lot of points with connections to all other points, and that's like the kind of social utopia for Guattari. It's like anything can be anything else. But what I was going to say was, it's like you mentioned earlier, the idea of the people to come, and there's this popular concept in Deleuze Guattari, but I think on some levels the people to come is nothing more than that. It's nothing more than Guattari learning how to drive. That's the people to come. It's like, it doesn't have to be something like totally different. It can be something, but it can be as well. I often think about this, like the kind of left and right readings of difference and repetition, where there's a reading of difference of repetition, which you can sometimes, I don't know still, but you definitely used to come across, which was like, well, everything is difference and repetition, right? It's like football is difference and repetition. That's the principle of difference and repetition. It's the same rules, it's the same field and everything, but every game is different. Right. And it's like, you can find passages like that in difference and repetition where you get that feeling. But then there's the other kind of thing, which is like the sublime, which is like, well, the real eternal return, it's going to be something totally like, you can't imagine that. Yeah. Like, it's going to literally blow your mind to pieces,
Only the extremes return, right?
Yeah. And then it's always like, oh, shit. I don't know if I'm up for that. Like, oh, how am I going to do that? Then it's too much. Then it's like, oh, okay. So then it's like, we're looking at extremely privileged examples that usually occupy the realm of art. And that becomes a problem if you want to talk about politics and things like that, because these things seem so far away. So, I find Laruelle more in that kind of category, where it's like the people to come is like a kind of a seductive but impossible thing that lives just over the horizon that we can't quite grasp or see or whatever. But whatever it is, it's going to be really fucking good, right? But we can't quite get our head around what exactly it's going to be, But then there is this other side to it too, which I think is, the Guattarian practice, which is like, it doesn't have to, that's micropolitics, right? Micropolitics is, it can be learning to drive. Learning to drive can like totally change everything. And this is this great moment in Molecular Revolution in Brazil, where Guattari says, I always quote this as his example of micropolitics. A portrait by Modigliani can change the faciality regime of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's so interesting to me, because it's like art, and it's like, nobody who really has anything to do with art would ever kind of countenance such an idea as being in the slightest bit plausible. But, for Guattari, it's like, it's not just that Guattari's being very enthusiastic, and quite possibly Guattari doesn't know a huge amount about art. But what it is more is that it's almost like he has to say that, because that's the bet of micropolitics, right? The bet of micropolitics is that anything can proliferate difference. It's not that the micropolitical event, whether it's a Modigliani portrait or whatever, is going to change things in a way that you can describe and say, well, it's going to change it like X, Y, and Z. What it's going to do, I think, for Guattari is, that's the point, is that it's a proliferation of difference. It's just the proliferation of creation that is the micropolitical moment. So it's not a specific political position, or it's not a specific series of historical events that you could maybe even trace. But it's just that at this moment, everything opens up and its possibility proliferates. So that's the kind of idea of liberation or of freedom, I think, that exists in Guattari. And that's exactly what he reads into the ready-made of Duchamp. So he says, okay, at first there is this taking out of its context and putting it into a new one, which is, what Cooper mentioned before, this kind of this non-signifying rupture. And then what emerges from the non-signifying rupture is this proliferation of contingency. Basically, it's just the proliferation of possibilities. So at that point, the ready-made can be anything you want, right? Yeah. Nothing specific, but it can be anything that you make it. You can connect it to whatever things are going on for you, and that becomes that. And that's the moment, the kind of political moment, the liberatory moment. But what's interesting about that is that doesn't really have a lot to do with the trajectory of the ready-made in the history of art, right? And the reason why it doesn't is because, and this is where Peter Osborne is super good on this, is because it completely avoids the distinction between art and not art. And so that's where, this very interesting interpretation of the ready-made that Guattari offers sort of vitalizes the ready-made and turns it into this sort of extremely interesting and positive example of something. But what it is, it's an example of ontogenesis. It's not an example of anything that really has anything to do with contemporary art in a historical sense. And the reason for that is because it ignores the kind of functionality of the ready-made in the history of modern contemporary art practice, which is precisely to chart this line, which in many ways you could argue is at the defining line of modern and contemporary art's development of the difference between art and non-art. And so that, I think, is really interesting to understand in relationship to how Guattari, and I think you can also apply this in some ways to Deleuze's reading of art as well, the way that they use art. And it's not so clear in Deleuze, because Deleuze engages with art history, which is pretty unusual in relationship to the kind of 68 thinkers. Because if you look at Lyotard, who also uses art a lot and engages with art a lot, but Lyotard is not really interested in art history itself and the history of art. He just picks and chooses various things. And when he's talking about sublime, he's mixing and matching all these things that, from the point of view of art history, it's kind of nuts what he's doing. It's like amateurish, maybe you would say. It's not interested in art historical relation. So although Deleuze does develop an art history in the Bacon book, nevertheless, it is, let's say, oriented around art's onto-aesthetic aspect or ontogenetic aspect. It's vitalist. It's vitalist kind of the way it demonstrates vitalism, if you want to put it in a kind of a more negative sense. And I think that's, that to me in more recent times has become really, really important, because I've been reading in particular the Peter Osborne books. I don't know if you know those, but they're books specifically about contemporary art. And what he wants to say is basically conceptual art completely changes everything, because conceptual art kind of projects an art which is not aesthetic. And that from that point on, the late 60s, contemporary art becomes what he calls post-conceptual art, because it becomes completely reorganized away from an aesthetic production and towards a conceptual production, which involves aesthetic aspects, but the aesthetic aspects are only used to kind of illustrate the conceptual kernel of what the work embodies or represents. So it made me really aware that all of these kind of 68 thinkers, that they are really, I don't know if you want to call it the arrogance of philosophers when it comes to art, but it's like art for them, what is so good about art is philosophical, right? It's ontological. That's what's so good about art. Art is so powerful. Art is so political. All of these things, because it's ontological, because it's emergence itself in the case of Guattari and Duchamp's ready-made. Whereas art itself it's not thinking in that way at all. Art is onto something else. Art is onto something that is also really radical, which is to move art away from a purely aesthetic production. But that's its own trajectory that is not really, it's intersecting a little bit with analytical philosophy, at least at the beginning. But then later on, it incorporates philosophy into itself, but on its own terms as a kind of a way of producing concepts. This has kind of been very important for me because it is about, in a way, the kind of, if you come at things from the point of view of the art, or if you occupy a position, let's say, internal to art, then the 68 position or the 68 animation of art seems like it's kind of quite far away. And you really see that at the end of the art section of What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy, where they basically reject conceptual art straight out. They say conceptual art, I mean, they are insulting as possible because they say, well, conceptual art doesn't produce concepts and it doesn't produce sensations. So it's just opinion, it's nothing. And from their point of view, you know, you can see it, you can see why they say that. But from the point of view of art, that's kind of not sustainable. That's like, it's basically like saying, okay, so where art is really only existing up to the late 60s.
Right.
You know, which is, I mean, yeah, that's kind of, it's
which is
nuts.
funny because it kind of, there's like an antagonism towards, I think, the simulacra, perhaps. I don't know. That's kind of like a little thought I just had. Because it incorporates cognition. I don't know, there's more thinking and metaphor, etc., involved in the conceptual process, right? Like, maybe I'm just assuming that based on like a kind of banal reading of it, but if my production of my object only serves as a vehicle for me to preach some type of message at you, for example, how is that really doing something? Whereas a pure aesthetic work that doesn't need a concept is hitting the unconscious, creating the affect at the unconscious level, as opposed to the conscious mind. And I don't know, the theater of representation, like these critiques of representation that I think they are very much against, because it goes back to the asignification. So something like music would be more, I mean, obviously Guattari says, what is it, redundancy of resonance, or whatever the phrase is,
frequency, like, and resonance, and interaction.
It's like that music. The music communicates to you on a level that is pre-conscious, unconscious. Versus if I take something like, you know, I'll use a banal example of the Cabinet of Wonders from someone like Hirst, right? You can take that and you can apply something like simulacra theory to it, right? But the object itself, is it really, what is it doing without that extra addendum or like that extra logical kernel that you have to consume, as opposed to music, which doesn't really, like, you can intellectualize music, but it's invading your body, you know, like an alien force that is different. I don't know if that helps kind of characterize what I'm trying to say.
In the most basic terms, the contrast between, you know, Deleuze and Guattari and the Osborne understanding of conceptual art and post-conceptual practice. Osborne says contemporary art or post-conceptual art, it has an historical ontology. So basically, it shares its ontology with.
I mean, it's kind of like philosophy in this regard, and kind of what Laruelle is trying to do to subvert philosophy.
That would be
not subvert, but like, you know, because I think there's a similarity in that it's so predicated on the historical development of and reaction to, right? Because art is responding to, this is a banal point too, but like, it's kind of, once the technical production gets to a point where we can take a photograph, then that creates a difference with regard to art and like painting, right? Because there's no need to paint when we can produce a photograph. But there's still there still kind of is on the, it's a weird duality in that sense, right? Because
one of the things that Osborne says is that post-conceptual art has what he calls a distributive ontology, which it shares with digital technology and with speculative capitalism, and that kind of embeds contemporary art, if you like, within the world, within the dominant within the dominant ontologies of the world, let's say it like that. Whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, and not just Deleuze and Guattari, I think Lyotard is very similar in this regard. Aesthetics, or the way that art uses aesthetics, is basically a way of taking us away from all of that. It's a kind of an escape mechanism. So it's a very different way of understanding art. And historically, maybe art shared this Deleuzian view up until the point of the late 60s, but then post that, I think art has really shifted and it no longer shares that idea. It's no longer interested in being an escape route in that way. It's interested in being a critical mechanism that is embedded within society and plays a directly political role. And the extent to which aesthetics is used, it is used to those aims, rather than as a kind of an onto-aesthetic experience that is going to be sublime or whatever you want to call it, that is going to kind of deconstruct the kind of conceptual framework by which we represent the world, which is this very ambitious, way that Deleuze and Guattari at least, see art.
What is something like the NFT monkey or art? What is that going to do really? I don't know.
It's going to make money. That's the idea of it.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about its what potential, like, you know what I mean? It's almost as if there's a foreclosure of art in a sense. Art is dead in the way that God is dead. Did almost seem, maybe it is. I don't know.
To come back to my piece, about chaosmosis, I think what's really interesting is seeing the relationship between, Eric Helier's Nicolas Bourriaud and to a certain extent Bifo, who I would call kind of, intra-art peoples, or their approach anyway. So they're kind of inside the art, and they're kind of using Guattari to animate a certain intra-artistic story. And then you've got Lazzarato, who's using Guattari's work on aesthetics in a much more kind of political and critical way. And the way that he reads the ready-made, unlike the others, is non-artistically, right? So Lazzarato is not interested in the artistic trajectory of the ready-made. He totally picks up on this idea of laziness and the way that it's basically a removal from the realm of work. It's kind of removing any sense of work from the artistic object. And I think that's really interesting because there is this crucial moment in chaosmosis where Guattari is talking about a kind of, it's like he's talking about the aesthetic paradigm as something that is in art, but it also exists kind of before, I say that in inverted commas, before art. It's like something that is sort of underlying art that can appear in art, but also can appear in everywhere else. And I think that's the sense in which Lazzarato is interested in aesthetics, is that it is an aesthetics that is kind of rinsed of its artistic reference. And
that's kind of my position. I think we need to read Lazzarato.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because, Lazzarato is basically a kind of more or less depressing read, because he's kind of like, he's more or less starting from the position of like, well, we've already lost, right? And, of course, he recognizes that Guattari is not exactly agreeing with that position, but he is kind of drawing the consequences of Guattari's analysis to more or less say that. So, I mean, some of what Lazzarato writes is absolutely horrifying, and I mean, going back to vitalism again, I mean, he wants to say that digital technology basically is a way of capturing vitalist creation at its point of emergence. And that's the moment where capitalism is able to exploit it right from the beginning. So it's like a sealed connection, and there's no way out of it. So yeah, it's like aesthetic paradigm is basically instrumentalized from its moment of emergence. So
yeah. Well, Nick Land says that capitalism is escape. Anytime you're doing escape, you're simply gonna fall back. You're gonna get sucked back into it. Capitalism is deterritorialization.
Well, there is a way of saying that. That is one of
control burn, destructive. The destructive creativity.
Yeah, but there is this sense of like going through and coming out the other side. I mean, that's that nihilistic. I would call it a kind of like a nihilistic optimism in that early Land work, which is that, it's like, let's embrace the assassins from the future and let's like, see what happens after that. It's like, there is this kind of sense of,
I mean, to me, it goes back to the question, should humanity be saved? To me, that's the question. Maybe not, ultimately. Maybe not. Like, maybe things should, yeah, exactly. Maybe humanity's not it. That's just the bricks. I mean, we wouldn't be the first. We wouldn't be the first creature to rule.
That's the part of
right.
Deleuze. That's the part of Deleuze where he kind of gets close to Nietzsche, and it starts getting possibly dodgy. But it's this question of selection. So I mean, humanity is not one thing, and there's a whole thing in Deleuze about selection, which is all about sort of affirmation, and affirmation is the technique by which the Übermensch emerges, and it's a highly selective process, and in Nietzsche's terms anyway, involves breeding. But, there is definitely this sense in Deleuze too, where, Deleuze is like, when you start reading a lot of Deleuze, you realize that the whole cut and paste thing, it pre-existed, digital technology, because the same phrases he'll use them over and over again, actually over quite long periods of time too. So one of the things that kind of pops up every now and again is you get the morals you deserve. And,
right.
So it's like, so I guess that's a kind of a weird roundabout way of trying to answer your question. Like, does humanity deserve to be saved? Well, you'd have to say, maybe in Deleuzian terms, yeah, the ones that want to escape humanity deserve to be saved.
And I mean, that would be very golden pathy, I think. That would be definitely in line with Leto. If you're within his historical epic, it's like you're fodder for history. And maybe that's what we are no matter what.
The problem with Leto, though, is on the one side, he's really interesting because he's a hybrid with another species. But on the other side, he's a god. He's a dictator. He's leading from the front, right? He's decided what humanity's future is, and he's taking us towards it. Well, maybe, okay, in the context of the book, that's not exactly true because it's about a prophecy or it's about a vision and so forth and so on. But, basically that's the kind of political drawback of the God Emperor of Dune.
We got into Dune.
We had to get there in the end.
Well, he said breeding. You said breeding, and I was like, yeah, okay. No, I don't know.
God damn it, Coop. Yeah.
I'm gonna write a book, Stephen, about Dune. I'm gonna write the definitive, totally galaxy-brained philosophical treatise on Dune, incorporating Laruelle, Deleuze, most heavily drawing from the cinema works.
I'm sure you're going to be in a competitive field, I'm sure, because, one of the chapters in my sci-fi book is about 2001, where I also tried to do a pretty exhaustive kind of take on it. And, it became one of those Sisyphean projects because you couldn't keep up with the definitive books on 2001. It was like people were producing the most extraordinarily detailed and often unlikely readings of the film, on a permanent basis. It's like, but yeah, no, definitely go for it, I would say, for sure. For sure. I still have a soft spot for the David Lynch one. And the TV
I do too.
one was not bad either, I thought.
Yeah.
See, I saw the David Lynch movie when I was like 6 years old and blew my fucking mind. Perfect. I've never gotten over it.
That's it. It determined your life's trajectory. It's like, we could trace back from this very moment.
For sure. Totally.
It's Coop's origin story.
It is. It really is. Yeah.
That's
it's a good one though. It's a good one. I would tell this anecdote from when I was a kid. I read Dune maybe when I was about 13. And one of the most overriding things I remember after finishing it was, why the fuck did I read Lord of the Rings?
When you read Lord of the Rings nowadays, you realize every other page is like some song or some kind of little tune that they're singing. And don't tell Nick I said this, though. He'll get angry. But no, I mean, all of this is good. And I was just looking at some of the last pages of Philosophy and Non-Philosophy, Laruelle's book. And he's talking about, if we stop opposing fiction and the real, if we stop measuring fiction by the real, if we completely derealize fiction, then we can see philosophy as a mode of fiction, make philosophy re-enter through non-philosophy as fiction. And I think that kind of still gets us in this notion of non-aesthetics that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
That when we treat philosophy as a mode of fiction, as what he calls philosophy fiction, there's science fiction, obviously, and he talks about that a little bit, but his novelty is thinking of philosophy fiction, philofiction, as he'll call it later. And again, it's not about the false or the powers of the false, as Nietzsche might have it. It's not even about an unfictionalizable in the sense of deconstruction. It's not even, but I think.
I think it has shades of like the virtual.
I mean, it does have shades. It does have shades of the virtual, but it's no longer about simulacra in a sort of Nietzschean sense.
Yeah.
About simulacra having a claim to truth, as Deleuze might.
Yeah, I think it's an anti-dualist, right? That's kind of a dualist.
Every philosophy has, if it has the status of fiction, then there's the sense in which there can be a proliferation of, variables. There can be, or as, Deleuze wants to call in, there's varieties in the sense of art, right? So I think that that's part of the aesthetics that we were
Yeah.
talking about, and what Laruelle.
Well, if philosophy comes from myth, right? Like that kind of the fictional aspect tracks. But sorry.
Yeah, maybe not coming from, but in terms of its subsoil, if you will, right? That myth would be the subsoil of philosophy, and what Thales saying in a all is water, but in a non-mythical mode, that you kind of have the birth of Western philosophy. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which that's
Flows, right?
I guess philosophy becomes myth, but in a new sense, right? Because now mythos doesn't mean false, because it's no longer about being posed against the real, or what comes closest to the real, or determining the real, which is obviously foreclosed to thought. I think this is where he's really close to Deleuze, the difference of repetition, right? Because the real is, if it is foreclosed to thought, it produces what he calls force of thought. It's thought power, right? Because its force of thought is based on the translation of Marx, right? It's force de travail. It's Arbeitskraft, right? It's thoughtcraft. It's Dinkencraft or something.
Predicated on encountering a problematic in the real or in the social or whatever. I don't know. In something.
Yeah, I mean, if the real forces thinking, it does have in terms of the status of problematics in a certain sense. And I think
I was thinking in the context of like necessity of being the mother of invention. So like you only have to think because you have a problem. Like you have to have a.
And I think that for 2,000 years, Euclidean geometry was perfectly suitable to thinking reality, quote unquote.
Right. Yeah. It's only when we encounter there's a new paradigm.
Like relativity, or
precisely,
or the thinking the curvature of the universe, right? That's when we need Riemannian surfaces.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And for millennia, philosophy has spontaneously existed and been perfectly suited to the problematics of the day, whether it be Epicurus and his followers and his friends kind of receding into their garden, or the Stoics sort of being cosmopolitan citizens of the cosmic fire. You can imagine each philosophy having its aspect of being in the city, right? To go to your work on Laruelle and urban studies. And I think that for Laruelle, he wants to be able to think, as you kind of pointed out very nicely, this notion of the city as a kind of positive void, whether it be the Cora or, the sort of, this gets back to your central question about what's the collective aspect of non-philosophy? Where does subjectivity go? I think this is kind of one of the themes that he had, and he still kind of hits on even today, this notion of introducing democracy into thought, if you will. Once philosophy stops, he suggests, if philosophy becomes fiction, philo-fiction in a new way, and it stops being opposed to the real, or stops being measured against a real that it can never measure up to, and that it only claims to be able to co-determine, if it stops fighting with amongst itself, what Kant calls metaphysics like a battleground, right? Like an arena, the Kampfplatz. If it stops fighting both science and other philosophies for the sort of valor of winning and vanquishing other philosophies to be the realist, then there can proliferate these different, non-philosophical aesthetics. Then there can be a kind of peace treaty, but now from science, what he calls generic science, to philosophy, and no longer from philosophy to science, which has always been the case on philosophy's own ground, even if science has ignored it and usually mocked it. I think that there can be a kind of utopia in the sense of Deleuze and Guattari, even in a what is philosophy sense, even though Laruelle mocks that text very strongly. And I think that the general consensus is a kind of mockery of what is philosophy. Like you kind of point out in your Chaosmosis review, even Guattari himself doesn't seem very close to their view of art in what is philosophy.
No, that's right. Well, they had a lot of trouble. That's a kind of very optimistic, sweet way of putting it, I think. I have a feeling you guys could probably carry on all night.
As an outro, do you want to tell us what you're working on now, and we can let you go?
what I'm working on now is kind of some kind of good geeky philosophical stuff. I'm kind of doing something about Kant's schematism and the kind of reception or reading of the schematism, particularly interested in the relationship between Heidegger's reading of the first critique and particularly of the schematism and Deleuze's use or kind of misuse, I guess you'd have to say, of Kant and difference and repetition. And then kind of using this as a way of, and I've also been reading Adorno actually, but that's a whole nother thing now. It's like a kind of an embarrassed admission that I've only just read the essay on the culture industry, and I have to say it's fucking amazing.
Yeah, it is.
And, and the way that he kind of uses the schematism there, or he kind of uses it, reminded me a lot of Lazzarato in a way. Anyway, so these various kind of interpretations of the schematism, and then trying to use those to form some kind of understanding of conceptual art, and the thing that what I was talking about before, this kind of way that conceptual art basically wants to totally shift the ground of art from an aesthetic production to a conceptual one. So basically cut out in its early forms, to cut out the aesthetic from the artistic production entirely, and then that kind of develops into its post-conceptual trajectory, if you like, drawing a lot on the work of this guy, Peter Osborne, that I also find very interesting, who's basically using critical theory to produce a kind of a very philosophical understanding of what he calls historical ontology of contemporary artistic practice. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I'm doing at the moment. That's pretty much the main thing I'm doing at the moment, actually. So a bit of the old, bit of the new. It's the usual kind of dance.
I think that sounds fascinating, and it seems to be continuing a trajectory that we find in your work. So I like that we get to hear more of this. And, I know we didn't necessarily focus on the breadth of your work, but we got to deep dive into some things that interest us. And I think that that's just as productive, perhaps, because what you told Coop, once you've written something, you kind of want to move on. So I like that we were able to.
I have to prep it before I come and talk to you guys, because I'm like, what the hell was that about? I can't remember a thing.
I think it would be nice once you've written more on maybe you have something to share with us in the future. Perhaps by this time next year, we'll have you back on, and we'd love to.
Oh, great. It'd be fantastic. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more, David. I think, it's so interesting, your position between Guattari and Laruelle, and many of the things that you said tonight, was super thought-provoking for me. Definitely introduced ways of looking at the relationship that never really occurred to me at all. So that's really cool. So keep up the good work,
We appreciate you having you on, and we appreciate your time. And it was great getting to the weeds with you. And as I said, I was playing a little bit defensive, but I wasn't trying to necessarily defend any position. I'm very much like devil's advocate, because I've had a lot of the reservations you've had, and I'm not fully settled on these kind of things, because I was kind of talking myself into this as I heard myself speaking. But in any case, thanks for coming on, and in about a week we'll let you know when the episode's out, and cool. We look forward to listening back, but we'll let you get to your dinner and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right, good on you. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Wonderful to see you again, and that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machine and Gun Conscious Happy Hour with Coop and Taylor. Once again, thanks to Stephen.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.